So good afternoon, everyone. This is the last installment of this academic year of the Health and the Public Interest Seminar Series. I think we've had a great series this year, thanks to a number of speakers who have participated in all the great discussion afterwards by the students and other guests. We're going to run this seminar as we usually do. We're going to start with an introduction by Birna Gustafsson in a moment, and then proceed to the talk by John Hoberman, and then take questions and answers starting with students. I want to say a couple things first. Number one, I've been working hard to get John Hoberman to speak in a series for over a year, and he always teaches a class in this time slot. So I went to the trouble to have him give a talk at George Mason University, where some of us have a related program, and was able to listen to him, but this is where I wanted him. So it's great to have him here. So the Health and the Public Interest Program is a program that looks at the social determinants of health and healthcare, all the other factors, marketing by pharmaceutical companies, ethnicity, race. So this talk fits right in, and we're thrilled to have John here today. So this being the last seminar, if you have been attending, you will get announcements next year as well, those outside folks there, and we'll welcome you back with open arms. We'll start somewhere around the second week of September probably, and have another bang up set of speakers for you. So students in a class, you have 1 week from today to turn in all your discussion prompts. After that, you're short of having a perfect score in the program, so please get on that. So without any further ado, Birna Gustafsson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. So it is my pleasure to introduce John Hoberman today. He is a social and cultural historian who has researched and published extensively in the fields of sports studies, race studies, human enhancements, medical history, and globalization studies. His interests in medical history include the history of medical racism in the United States. He has lectured at many medical schools and other medical institutions on this topic. Professor Hoberman is the author of multiple books, including Black and Blue, The Origins and Consequences of Medical Racism, and has been widely published for the public audience as well. His courses include Race and Medicine in African American Life at the University of Texas at Austin, and the Racial Dimension of Medicine at the University of Texas Dell Medical School. Welcome, Professor Hoberman.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Dr. Myers and Dr. Hoberman and all the colleagues who have collaborated in making this this talk possible. Let's see, could we display the first page of the, there we go, thank you very much. The racial dimension of medicine, I think, is a useful term because it is comprehensive, that it recognizes a topic I'm going to be addressing very soon, and that is the way that that what is medically significant is not confined to doctor-patient relationships in a formal sense. It's not confined to what happens in clinics. It is not confined to what happens in hospitals, but it is rather an enormous societal space in which events of medical significance happen, any number of which we read about in dramatic headlines in various news reports, and I will be introducing that topic, as I said, very shortly. The racial dimension of medicine will include a micro dimension in the sense that it is extremely important to study relationships between medical personnel and their patients. And the prerequisites for effective, which means sympathetic and understanding, and patient responses from physicians when faced with this dizzying array of patients who come in with various kinds of problems and different personalities, and last but not least, different so-called racial and ethnic identities. And so the racial dimension of medicine reminds us that the racial dimension of American life has been a part of American medicine, an intimate and unremovable and often dangerous part of American medicine ever since the plantation medicine, so-called, of the middle of the 19th century. I focus primarily on the last century, beginning in the early decades of the 20th. I think it is useful for various reasons. That's what I've been doing for 30 years, is studying the last 100 years of medicine and how have race relations worked and not worked. What are the problems that have affected relationships between medical personnel and especially patients of color over the past 100 years. I specialize in race relations concerning Black people and white people because I grew up in the segregated 50s, and that made a quiet but deep impression upon me. And I think that my boyhood reactions to the race relations that I saw in the 1950s are the reason that I got into race studies a third of a century ago. Next slide, please. I have, as Birna Gustafsson mentioned, I have taught a couple of courses. I've taught, started off as Race in Medicine and African American Life 12 times in the last 21, 22 years. Now, in the last 5 years, I teach it every fall. I also taught as guest faculty, as pro bono teacher at the UT Dell Medical School, which has a very progressive reputation. I taught an elective called the Racial Dimension of Medicine for 4 years, and then I quit in protest because, like the vast majority of medical schools, UT Dell, despite its reputation, does not take the racial dimension of medicine seriously. It refuses to put anything like social medicine, including race and medicine studies, into the curriculum. Here is the book that was published in 2012, and anyone who wants it on 6 PDFs free of charge need only email me. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are the courses that I already mentioned. Next slide, please. Now, here is an event I remember very well. This is January of 2017, and this is an entire week of race and medicine talks and workshops that were held sponsored by the White Coats for Black Lives chapter at Florida State University. In January 2017, I was the last of the speakers. This happened because primarily medical students of color organized it. They demanded it. And the white male dean of that medical school really had no choice but to let these intellectually and ethically militant medical students put on a week of studies and presentations about, frankly, medical racism. I bring this up because when you study the medical world, you're always studying the phenomenon of power. This is an enormously powerful and influential institution. It is very hierarchical, and there is a great deal of vulnerability at the lower level when it comes to roles such as medical student or resident, or there's always going to be medical personnel who rank above you. And so that the issue of power, of what people can say, what people can object to, what people can do, is still up for negotiation. There is a lot of bullying in medicine, and this is recorded in countless articles, and not just in academic medicine, but in more standard medical journals. In other words, this is a world in which you have to study power if you're going to make sense of what goes on in the racial dimension of medicine, or frankly, within the culture of American medicine as we know it. And so that is why I highlight the achievement of these medical students in bringing a week of serious study of race and medicine to the Florida State School of Medicine on this occasion. Next slide, please. Here are the people who did it, and that is yours truly in the middle. And it is important to remember that it is possible for medical students to learn about the racial dimension of medicine and to make demands of medical faculty that the curriculum be expanded in a useful and rational direction so that medical students can be adequately and properly prepared to deal with the variety, the racial and ethnic variety of patients they will be responsible for treating. Next slide, please. Pre-medical apartheid is a term I thought up in order to characterize what I have experienced, especially over the past 5 years or so, as a teacher who gives classes and lectures, on campus, mostly off campus, on a very welcome occasion like this. And what that refers to is that over the last 5 years, what I've found is that the undergraduate students at the University of Texas at Austin who are willing to study race and medicine include very few white students and even fewer white male students. So in other words, the student population that is willing to study this material skews very heavily in a non-white direction and very heavily in a female direction. I think that has to do with women being more inclined to take seriously what vulnerable people are facing. There are various kinds of vulnerable people. Women can be seen as a class of very vulnerable people in certain ways. But I think that this is important because, remember, if this population, and we're talking a lot of pre-meds here, I've sent any number of people to medical school having learned more about race and medicine as undergraduates than they will ever encounter in medical school, which is likely to be very little. And so that if you have a small wave, but I think a growing wave of undergraduate pre-medical students of color entering medical schools that, again, are overwhelmingly run by white males and who are really quite uninterested in the kind of curriculum that I am presenting to you today, that is an interesting situation. And what I would expect is that there's going to be a growing population of medical students who will, over the next generation, say, demand that medical curricula be modified in such a way as to provide, frankly, the sort of material that I have a limited time to present to you today. And I'll just note, editorially, that there's no way we're going to get through this PowerPoint, but this talk is being recorded, and Dr. Myers and everybody else has my permission to send this PowerPoint to any interested party, especially students. So that is pre-medical apartheid, the phenomenon and the term that I coined. Next slide, please. All right, now here we come to a very important subject. And that is, what is a racially pathogenic society? Pathogenic, the patho there refers to pathology, that there is something wrong, that there is a disorder. The genic, going back to the Greek roots of English words, refers to origins, like the word Genesis, for example. And so what I say, or what I claim, and of course it's all up for discussion, is that the more you look at the medical experiences of African Americans in particular, this is the minority, as I said, that I have chosen to study in relation to the white population over the past 30 years, that when you say that an environment, and a society, is an enormous environment, when you say an environment is pathogenic, what you mean is that there are aspects of this society, in our case, that are sources of disorders, of illness. And this could be organic illness, or it could be mental illness. It could be organic trauma or psychological trauma. And we will see some familiar examples of that very shortly. So my thumbnail definition of a pathogenic society is a society that is set up in such a way that there are multiple sources of multiple causes, multiple negative influences on, in this particular case, African Americans, that are going to be productive of a variety of disorders that American medicine is responsible for treating. Next slide, please. All right, now here we get down to business, because everybody is aware that this 16-year-old was shot by an elderly, apparently terrified white man for no good reason at all. But the essential point to make here, and of course we've had multiple cases, we could recite the names of Black men who have been killed by police, et cetera. The list goes on, and it seems to grow every week. This is a single event, and you could say that this Black teenager is the victim. Apparently, despite having taken a shot to his head, he is making a miraculous recovery. So that apparently 16-year-old Ralph Yarrow, from a basic medical standpoint, is going to be made well, as they say. But the point is that this incident has an impact that reaches far beyond the 16-year-old whom we saw in a photograph lying in a hospital bed. There are thousands of people, and not all of them young Black men, who are going to be psychotraumatically affected by this event the way they have been psychotraumatically affected by the many preceding events. And this is not just an impression I'm taking out of the Washington Post. When you look at the public health literature of the past, say, 5 years plus, and even the more standard medical literature, you will see a number of peer-reviewed articles about the mass psychological trauma that police brutality incidents cause in the wider population. So that the person, the young Black man who gets pushed up against the wall, or who gets shot or stomped on the ground, or in this case, shot by a totally irresponsible, who knows what the mindset was, 84-year-old man, he's not the only victim. And so this is one aspect of what I was trying to define a minute ago as a pathogenic society. That one could argue that the racist component of American policing, which is very real, is an extremely important source of pathogenicity for the Black population. And that is just one. That is why I talked about the pathogenic society having exhibiting a number of phenomena, including policing that is far more violent than the policing in any other comparable Western society. That this is pathogenic, and that this is not just a Washington Post article about a shooting. It is not just a Washington Post article about a cross-racial shooting. This is medical material. That is my point. That the racial dimension of medicine includes a phenomenon like this one, especially from a public health, a public mental health perspective. And as I said, this has been being written about by peer-reviewed public health authors for the last 5 or so years. Next slide, please. All right, here is part of the family that has to deal with the shooting trauma of young Ralph Yarl. Next slide, please. This, of course, is a very recent event. What was kind of unique about this terrible, terrible incident where a Black man is anything but a criminal. Who knows what image of this man was in the minds of the police officers who beat him to death, literally beat him to death. The quote unquote unique aspect of this is that the 5 principal officers who beat him, who committed this homicide, were Black men, which raises the whole question of studying American policing, which actually I've done. I spent 10 years on a book about anabolic steroid use among American police officers. I learned a lot about the police. So that this is, I'm kind of double prepared to look at incidents like this, but this is traumatic. And it is not just the fact that this innocent man was killed, it is rather that when you look at the media coverage of something like this, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that this is going to be a traumatic experience for millions of people. Next slide, please. Here is, now this is a commentary from an article. The URL of the article is at the bottom of the PowerPoint page so that people can access it there. This is a writer named Chauncey De Vega, who published in Salon on January the 31st. And this is really interesting prose, because what he is doing on the base as a reaction to the Tyree Nichols killing is to really translate it in a sense into quasi-medical terminology. Such stress and anxiety are experienced both individually and collectively by Black people in America as we await the next video of another Black person brutalized by the police and other agents of the law. It is a perpetual feedback loop of trauma. Immediate trauma comes from witnessing routine violence. The re-traumatization results from the incident is a reminder that, it'll happen again, because anti-Black violence is systemic in American society. Living in a racist society is trauma. Now, there is a translation, if you will, of the term a pathogenic society. That in a certain sense, Chauncey De Vega is talking about a pathogenic society when he says living in a racist society is trauma. The racist society is the environment, is the quote unquote pathogenic society, and one medical consequence of living in this environment is what he is calling trauma. It is what psychologists and other mental health professionals have termed racial battle fatigue. A new term to me, but it is, I think, a useful term. And then one more quotation, beyond the clinical language, because he realizes that he's talking about a medical phenomenon. This is not just a policing phenomenon. It is not just a history of racism phenomenon. It has a very important medical, in this case, perhaps psychiatric dimension. Racial battle fatigue causes brown and Black people in America to live shorter lives than white people. That is a fact. And to die at higher rates from heart disease, strokes, cancer, high blood pressure, and other maladies. So he's translating, he is making another extremely important point. And that is, this is the psychosomatic dimension of it, that what happens to us, quote unquote, mentally, what happens in the realm of emotional trauma and panic and injury can be translated, is translated into organic phenomena that are of medical relevance, such as longevity, such as death rates from heart disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is an enormous phenomenon, and Mr. De Vega has described this very clearly. And by the way, if you want to talk, the next time somebody raises questions about whether systemic racism exists in American society, from my perspective, there is no better accumulation of evidence than American medical culture and its history over the past 100 years or so. When you look at the long list of medical disorders to which human beings are vulnerable, that are taught, and this is coming 99% from the refereed medical literature. When you look at the same time at the racially differential provision of critical medical services and treatments to white patients and Black patients respectively, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the treatments for heart disease or cancer or strokes. The same thing is going to be found in hip replacements. And that is that the incidence of morbidity and mortality, of disease and death in the Black population for every category of disorder is going to be higher in the Black population than in the white. And not coincidentally, the provision of this long list of medical services, all the way to hip and knee replacements, is going to be less for the African-American medical population than for the so-called white medical population. It is systemic. All right, this is not a mixed situation, and this is a very important piece of evidence when we try to think rationally and insightfully about what racial identity and the consequences of racial identity mean in American society. Next slide, please. This is a very interesting article. Again, this is from STAT, which the STAT, which is a sort of a quasi-popular medical publication that I think is pretty good. In counties with more Black doctors, Black people live longer. Astonishing study finds. I read this last night. The finding was that if you are living in a county with only one Black doctor and you compare it to a county with 0 Black doctors, there is going to be an elevated number for longevity in the county that has 1 Black doctor compared to the county that has none. This is consistent over, over their data set, over a number of counties. It is in one way mysterious. I don't claim to understand how this happens. I have a guess, and the guess is connected to the word morale, M-O-R-A-L-E, morale. With what sort of hope or confidence do we face the task of living or surviving or coping with the stresses that we encounter? Think about this one. Next slide, please. I'm checking the time. All right. Black pregnant women are tested more frequently for drug use, even though they don't use drugs any more than white women do. Of course, it's racial bias. Of course, it is stereotypes about Black female behavior. What I'm saying is that if Black women walk around with the knowledge that they are thought of, that the default position is that they are illicit drug users, that this is a source of stress that is going to do nothing good to their health status. Okay, next slide, please. Well, the cause célèbre in the area of medical racism for the past few years has been Black maternal mortality rates, which are something like, in this society, are 3 times higher about than white women who give birth. I just saw an article that said that the ratio in Britain is 5 to 1 rather than 3 to 1. One of the fascinating data points here is that if you are in the population of African-American women who have earned PhDs, and you compare this group with white women who have graduated from high school, the maternal mortality among the Black PhDs is going to be significantly higher than among the white people who have only graduated from high school. That is interesting for one reason, because education, long promoted as a solution for the advancement of African Americans in this society, apparently confers no medical protection on Black women who give birth. All the things you associate with a PhD, a higher standard of living, a better place to live, feeling appreciated, having a sense of accomplishment, morale. Your morale should be better. It's not protective. And the question is why? And I do not propose to answer that question right now. Next slide, please. All right, well, the pain, the racially differential treatment of pain is a tradition in American medicine, which is to say, to this day. There's the famous 2016 study, but it's been multiply reported that Black children in hospitals get less pain relief than white children do. There's a long history that accounts for this. We don't have time for the pain section, the pain topic today, other than to notice it. It is a very significant topic. Next slide, please. All right, now this is extremely important. This is a very recent article. Again, the URL will be at the bottom of the PowerPoint page. And here is Dr. Arlene Geronimus, who is a very important figure. She's at the University of Michigan, has been for a long time. Her theory of weathering goes back to 1990, when she proposed it at that time. Believe it or not, and this is complicated, she was getting death threats for having suggested this. The point is that weathering is a phenomenon that consists of various kinds of stress, chronic stress. It has to be chronic stress. Chronic stress that wears people down. They don't get, they're under stress at work. They could be under stress at home. They're under stress because of financial circumstances. They're under stress because their children don't have the resources that a lot of other children do. And so that the term weathering and the theory of weathering, that it produces medical organic phenomena such as higher blood pressure, higher cortisol, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very important and sort of comprehensive idea or theory to accommodate what I will simply call the medical consequences, the multiple medical consequences of living with stress. And so say a minority person goes to the doctor, and let's say they have a pretty good relationship, and there's good communication, and the doctor has his or her resources, and the patient, the medical literacy experience of the patient, is going to vary according to whom you're dealing with as a patient. The doctor says, well, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. What the doctor really cannot do is address in any sort of effective way or immediately effective way the stress process, the weathering that patient has been going through for years and years and years, and has in the process developed a number of chronic conditions in order, as a result of having been put under stress chronically for a long period of time. And the more time I spend in this field, the more important I think the word stress is for accounting for a lot of what we see in terms of the negative medical situations of minority patients in particular. But yeah, we have 7 minutes left. The next slide, please. Oh, racial health. Next slide, please. We've all heard about racial health disparities. That this happens to this population and something different happens to that population. People of color fare worse than their white counterparts across many measures of health status. That is a fact. It is easily documented. And it is documented again and again by organized medicine, in part because it is, it's discomforting in a way. One regrets that this population bears a disproportionate medical burden compared to another population. But the danger of talking about racial health disparities is that they can be presented as a kind of a natural phenomenon, that this is something nature did, that this is not a product of human agency. This is not a product of the way societies have been built in terms of power relations, of, who gets to live here and who does not get to live here. Who gets situated next to toxic dumps and who does not get situated next to toxic dumps, who lives within a reasonable distance of medical facilities and who doesn't get to live in reasonable proximity to medical. There are dozens of these circumstances that are the product of how human societies have been put together that produce disease, that account for racial health disparities, so-called. So the message here is, don't mistake a racial health disparity as some sort of natural phenomenon, like the northern lights, or the temperature of the ocean or something like that. This is a human-made situation that humans, properly motivated, have the power and the means to deconstruct and reconstruct in a way that would produce far more medical justice for people who do not have as much money as the white pop, which most of which doesn't have that much to begin with. But you see the point. All right, the next slide, please. Makes the same point. EPIC refers to the Epic Health record system, but it just confirms what we've already seen. The next slide, please. And more of the same. Chronic disease, death rates by race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. Okay, racial treatment disparities. Now here we get to a subject that is much less discussed than racial health disparities. That can be measured, their data sets. Isn't it too bad that the African-American population is suffering far disproportionate end-stage renal disease in comparison to the white population, by some arithmetic multiple, which means what? It means dialysis. It means the conundrum of whether the dialysis patient is going to be recommended for a kidney transplant, assuming, of course, that an eligible kidney happens to be available, and thousands die in America every year because there isn't enough organ donation. My driver's license says I'm an organ donor. If there's enough of that, you could save a lot of lives that way. But racial treatment disparities are they are a more uncomfortable topic for American medicine than racial health disparities, which, as I emphasized, can be thought of or imagined to be some sort of a natural phenomenon. Oh, that's just the way those people are. I mean, if you went back 100 years, say to the 1920s, and decades later than that, but let's go back to the 20s, where you can read unfiltered racism in the standard medical journals, like JAMA, for example, American Heart Journal, you name it. You will find a medical style of thinking that is really quite fatalistic about the medical status of the Black population. That's just the way they are. They're hyper vulnerable to tuberculosis. They're hyper vulnerable to syphilis. They do not know how to live with proper standards of cleanliness. They don't pay attention. Their child, the so-called Negro patient was a term used 100 years ago in American medical journals. And this was, of course, an incompetent patient. No wonder these people suffer medically to the extent that they do, because that's just the way they are. Now, one of the great things about this whole topic in recent years, and even in the medical literature, although it happens most dramatically in quality journalism, is prying medical thinking away from this idea, this habit of thought that said that's just the way those people are. They are not going to they're going to be much less likely to comply with the physician's instructions than the white patient. That is a thought habit. That Black possible candidate for a kidney transplant, he doesn't really want it. He's content with dialysis. I mean, they've just begun. Well, frankly, this started 20 years ago in one publication. But if you look hard enough, you can try to reconstruct the thinking of the nephrologist, the kidney expert, the transplant surgeon, about the decision-making process that is either going to grant or not grant access to a replacement kidney to that Black patient. It's very complicated, very interested, and there is room for human bias in the medical mind to play a role in that process. So, I'm 1 minute over. Dr. Myers, we've made it through a fraction of the PowerPoint, as I correctly predicted, but hopefully this is enough food for thought to animate questions from anyone who is interested in or comments for that matter. And I'll remind everyone that this PowerPoint is available, and the remainder of it can be studied by anybody who cares to do so once these nice people send the PowerPoint to you.
Yeah, and if any of you who aren't in the program want either the PowerPoint or Dr. Hoberman's excuse me, PDF that he generously offered to share, please send that request to hapi.georgetown.edu. So we'll get that to you. Yes, that's a ton of stuff for thought. Thank you so much, John, for opening up this subject for us to kind of pick apart here in the discussion session. So Birna is going to lead that, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you so much for your presentation. As Dr. Myers said, we are going to start with HAPI students, or those who are in this course, before we move on to any others. But if there's anybody who has a question or wants to put it in the chat, please do so. But I can start us off also. I do have a question about how the current movement and tactics of the banning critical race theory movement, how that could affect, from a public health perspective, what effect do you think that will have either on children in school now or just in general on our society? I know that it's not something that you focus on as you teach in university, but I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Well, that is what they call a great question. And as a matter of fact, I did kind of address your question in advance when I anticipated at least the possibility that some politician in the Texas legislature will get his hands on my syllabus, which I'm sure I sent that to Dr. Myers last fall, and of course I can send any relevant documents to anybody who wants them, including the undergraduate syllabus. First of all, I don't think the politicians who are making political hay on critical race theory have a clue as to what it actually is. My understanding of critical race theory is that it is willing to study the ways in which racist ideas take root in major institutions, such as the police, the medical culture, so-called organized medicine, and actually shape the way these professionals, whether they're police officers or whether they're medical people, how they treat people. Now, I don't have to tell you that it is absolutely absurd to ban that sort of thinking from the study of history and society. It is naked censorship. It is the lobotomizing of historical study. It is absolutely anti-intellectual. All right, it's all of those things. If an ambitious anti-CRT politician got his hands on my syllabus, he would see all sorts of things that displeased him. He would see, for example, that there are any number of readings that are going to, quote unquote, make white people uncomfortable. Because if you are Ron DeSantis or Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, I mean, this particular Republican Party project, and it's extremist because it's radically anti-intellectual, is that, you know, thou shalt not make a white student or anybody uncomfortable on the basis of having discussed the racial situation in America. Now, of course, that is patently absurd, that America's racial situation has been uncomfortable and a whole lot worse than that for a very long time. And all you have to do is read the news to know that it is hardly over. So, yeah, I mean, just to sort of bring it on home, if an ambitious politician in that legislature said, you know, what in the world is this being, why is this, how can this possibly be taught to University of Texas undergraduates? Well, it's being taught as historical reality. There is a lot of uncomfortable history, to put it mildly, that responsible academics and others are going to write and promulgate so that people can understand the human past, as it were. All right, is that a halfway adequate answer to your question?
Of course, yeah, that is very helpful. And it is good to hear you also mention the anti-intellectual aspect of it, because I think that's very important.
It's profoundly anti-intellectual. And you know what I have never seen? I have never seen, and I watch plenty of cable news, not to mention the news. I've never seen anybody say, oh, Senator so-and-so, would you please define critical race theory? American politicians get away with murder from the softness of the journalistic treatment that they are accorded, especially on television. It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. But the sensible thing to do would be to find out whether these people can actually define what they object to.
That's very well put. Yes. Are there any questions from anyone in the program at this time?
So, you know,
Sorry.
I'm sure we'll get some more student questions, but let me just interject something while they pull their thoughts together, as it were. John, I really think that this talk and the way that you phrased or framed this issue of kind of the role of racial classifications in medicine is or in health is damaging. And for me, you know, as I've kind of worked through my own mind as I followed this area, it's been kind of a multi-step process, and I just want to throw this out there. So when I first started hearing people talk about in a case report or physician's notes that they shouldn't start out with a 6-year-old African-American male or a 45-year-old Caucasian woman because of the fact that it engenders what was described in that first talk I heard about this as sort of implicit bias and you just shouldn't do it. And when I questioned that, I really didn't get any good answers to, more meaty substance to that. Now, when we heard from Dayrup and Graves a couple of weeks ago, so this is, jumping ahead several years, but Andrea told a story of a 6-year-old Black patient who was in the hospital, and the pathologist was looking at all the information, and they said, so what's the story with this Black kid with cystic fibrosis? And that kid had never been diagnosed, according to this story, because you don't think about a 6-year-old Black kid with cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a white disease, right? So there's a misdiagnosis or misdiagnosis, either one as a result of that. But then, like, in revising a textbook over the last several months, I've been trying to, work through a lot of stuff. And this weekend I was working on our chapter on diabetes, and I got into a discussion with Andrea about some of the language that we had used in a previous edition. And, basically when I looked at type 2 diabetes, it seemed like you have to say something about Eastern Europeans and Native Americans and African Americans having a higher incidence. Now, maybe if you want to spend a whole chapter talking about what goes into that, it's okay, to say that. You're going to tease it apart, but something in between has to happen, because if you look at that literature and the reasons why that racial disparity exists, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but it's maybe 5 or 10 or 15% due to genetics. And the rest of it is due, as I think we all know, but ignore when we see that first sentence: diet, exercise, nutrition in general, all these other social determinants of health, right? I think that kind of explains why I'm so interested, and why I think this program needs to be interested in this racial determinants of let's say, health and healthcare, so to kind of change around John's title. John, do you think that's a fair statement?
Well, I think that what you're addressing isn't it called a case presentation?
Right. I mean, there's different ways it happens, but yeah.
There is a trend that I've seen anyway, away from the racially identified case presentation. Now, as I understand it, your objection is, look, you might, you might miss something. You might miss if you do not make the racial identification.
But you might create something too, right?
Well, what you can create is an absence of bias. And one of the surprising things that I got, I may have mentioned this the last time we were talking, in the book Black and Blue, there's a wonderful paragraph taken straight from an email by a senior VA doctor in New York, who I don't think he was too pleased about my book, but he sent me this great paragraph about the dangers of the case presentation. This is a 70-year-old Black man who, et cetera, et cetera. And to my surprise, what I would call a conservative-minded physician said that, this is potentially dangerous. And so I think that his sense was that, generally speaking, the racial case presentation was more likely to do harm than good. Now, as you point out, there are certain expectations of what a patient of this or that race or ethnicity is likely to present with, and so that the Black child with cystic fibrosis is, of course, an anomaly. and the quote unquote white person with sickle cell is going to be considered an anomaly. And of course, doctors are going to, use the percentages, as it were, in order to estimate the chances of whether this or that disorder is going to be present in this patient who is racially labeled this way or that way. So that, I mean, there's a bit of a conundrum there. That's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Well, I won't take any more of the discussion time here. So back to Berna.
Yeah, so before I call on Brian, I do see a question from a student in the chat. So Matt Reeser asked, since you did mention about police earlier in your seminar, I'm curious about what the future of police reform looks like to you and how we can frame it as a public health matter moving forward to address racial disparities in health.
Another great question, because I'm thinking about doing a lot more writing on the police. And one of the things that, as a citizen that you have to ask yourself is American policing reformable? And to what degree and in which ways, and will it ever transcend this very persistent racism, the dimensions of which are hard to measure, although one way to measure them is to collect stories about the the racist posts on social media, closed social media, that police officers in this city and that city and that city have been caught doing in terms, really vile sort of language. So that understanding the police is hard. The prospects for police reform, it's something I think about. I'm not immediately optimistic for a variety of reasons, but this topic should not take over the few minutes that are left. I will mention one or two things. There is a tremendous peer pressure within a police force, so that the so-called bad apples can have a disproportionate effect on standards. There's a tremendous resistance to informing on anybody. There's a certain number of people who are going to sign up in order to project force against other human beings. There's a tremendous emotional toll taken upon police officers that is rarely talked about. You almost never see that in the police shows. American audiences have been subjected to something like 300 or 400 police series on television in the last 70 years. The emotional vulnerability of the police officer is rarely touched on. The divorce rate is twice as high. The domestic violence rate is at least twice as high. I think because of the stress, the emotional traumas that police officers absorb as a result of the kind of work they do. Don't mistake me. I'm not saying that this is some sort of an excuse for police misconduct. It isn't. It's just that I don't think that we can reach the point of having a sensible, rational public discussion of American policing until all of this is taken into consideration, including a profound and widespread racist tradition that is nowhere near to being gone at this point.
So moving on to Brian, I see that you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for a really informative presentation here. So you talked about like medical care at its worst, especially in history, which is openly racist. And it seems like there are obvious things that can and have been done to deal with that, like taking racist ideas out of textbooks and things like that. But at its best, it's still the case that every provider has unconscious bias, racial bias of some kind. Do you have any suggestions on how we can deal with that second part, the like last mile issue of unconscious racial bias that just seems to exist in everyone's head, either in a perfect world without anti-CRT politicians or in the current environment?
Well, I've been saying for some time, and this was the point of my refusing to teach at UT Dell Medical School anymore. It would be really nice if medical schools, apart from maybe Duke, Temple, and Mount Sinai, began to take the racial dimension of medicine seriously, and so that the white people who run American medical education, with the exception of a handful of historically Black medical schools, and frankly, I don't know. I wonder how well they do, to be perfectly frank. I mean, I've lectured at Meharry several years ago. I think that what I had to say, which was much similar to what I've said today, I don't think that is part of the general currency at Meharry, even though it's a Black institution. So that if so-called organized medicine could make good on its promise following the George Floyd murder and that enormous scandal, the so-called reckoning, the so-called racial reckoning, you had all sorts of medical organizations, JAMA, the New England Journal, the American Association of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, for heaven's sakes, issued an anti-racist statement saying that, oh, we're going to be better, we're going to be paying attention to the situation of Black people in the medical context. Frankly, I don't think those people know where to begin. For white people who have, and senior people, people in their 50s and 60s who have held power in medical institutions, who have basically not lifted a finger in the direction of trying to better understand the needs of patients of color, to expect these people to do anything after they put out, and all the statements read the same, oh, we're going to be better, we really care, et cetera. What I told my students was they don't have a clue. I don't think those white medical administrators would know how to integrate their medicals, racially integrate their medical school, racially integrate their curriculum, for goodness sakes. I don't think they know how to do it. They were under political pressure to say the right thing in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. I wouldn't call that a cynical point of view. I think it's a realistic point of view. So that, and it is not a very satisfactory answer to your question, because it's a kind of a pessimistic answer to your question. If I don't know how much influence you may or may not have in the medical world. We haven't met yet, but anything that anybody can do to get medical educators to take seriously the kinds of issues that I have been presenting today, and to integrate them into curriculum and not leave it to, some guy who walks in and says, I'll be guest faculty for free and teach this course to your medical students, which I did for 4 years. And then I just became very, very disillusioned with their lack of interest in doing any of this. Promises not kept, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big institutional question, and I'm not a cynic. I think that this is realism, and this is why I brought up close to the beginning of our session, I showed you the picture of those medical students of color who demanded, some real attention to the racial dimension of medicine at Florida State. It's tough. Medical student activism is tough to keep going because people graduate, people go into very demanding clinical rotations and the whole thing. But what you need is a real major attitude transplant at the top of the profession. I'll tell you, I will share. Okay, we got 5 minutes. This is There was a scandal at JAMA in the first half of 2021, when Dr. Edward Livingston did the podcast where he claimed that structural racism did not exist in American medicine. In other words, here's the deputy editor of JAMA, he's totally ignorant of the racial dimension of medicine. That tells you something. All right. How many ignoramuses of this type are occupying powerful positions in American medicine? All right. Then you take one step up from Dr. Livingston as the deputy editor, and then you go to the editor, and he's out. I mean, he was an embarrassment, and so they kicked him out of his editorial position. Then you go up to Dr. Howard Baukner, who was the editor. And Dr. Baukner, and this was reported in a wonderful article in BuzzFeed News, which just disappeared from the face of the earth, unfortunately, but was confirmed in the Washington Post. The Dr. Baukner was approached by a couple of medical authors, including it was David Williams, the senior African-American medical sociologist at Harvard. And so David Williams and another author present this article to Howard Baukner, the editor of JAMA. And he says, well, it's all very well and good, but I'm not going to allow for the use of the word racism. You're going to have to substitute racial discrimination or something like that. The editor of JAMA would not allow the use of the word racism in JAMA because, as he put it, he was afraid it was going to cost him readers. I mean, this is Fox News, for heaven's sakes. You know, if you don't please your audience, you're out of business. And so this sort of behavior, this sort of censorship, this sort of whatever you want to call it, happened within, not that many years ago at the top of JAMA. That is why I recommended a minute ago, in response to your challenging issue, that there has to be a big attitude transplant at the top of so-called organized medicine, which is supposedly organized, but cannot organize to make sure that Black kids in hospitals get the same analgesic relief that white kids do.
Thank you.
So we have only 2 minutes left. So if anyone has any more comments or questions, quick ones. Otherwise, I think it is getting to be time to wrap up, but I would just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. It is a topic that we discuss at length here in the HAPI program. So it was really great to hear everything today.
Thank you so much, John.
Well, I'm very glad to have had yet another opportunity to discuss this material with thoughtful people who care.
Thanks, John, and best wishes for navigating the waters of politics and Texas universities, given what's going on there. I put a link to an article that came out yesterday in the Texan about the attempt to quash tenure, which would obviously put you at jeopardy. Thanks for what you do and for being bold enough to say things that need to be said.
Well, you're very kind. They can't take my tenure away because this doesn't go into effect until September the 1st. But who knows? Maybe they'll hang me on a brutal anti-CRT law or something like that. But at any rate, we'll go down swinging. So thanks again for this opportunity. It was great to talk to everyone.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending today and all year. And we'll see you back in September. Take care and feel free to send comments about the series to the program email, which was happy@georgetown.edu. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.